This one observation is alone sufficient for the vindication of what is asserted with respect to our reforming period in the Presbytery's Act and Testimony. But I judge it my duty to endeavor to do justice to that despised period of our Reformation by considering more particularly the treatment that our author of the essay has given the Assembly 1638 and other famous assemblies. And, in order to this, I shall premise a short historical account of that wonderful turn, the foresaid year. 'Tis, as I have already observed, a considerable loss unto this church that we have not a full and complete history of that period. However, I shall make use of such helps as I have at hand, and amongst others of the Latin history, entitled Historia Montumum in Regno Scote, or the History of the Commotions in the Kingdom of Scotland. This history was writ, according to some, by Mr. Spang, but according to others by Mr. Bailey, who was first minister at Kilwinning, and a member of the Assembly 1638, and afterwards principal of the College of Glasgow, and one of the commissioners of this church to the Assembly at Westminster. The Latin style of the said history is agreeable to that of Mr. Bailey's and his other writings, and if need were, other evidences of his being the author of that history might even at this distance of time be produced. I likewise make use of a manuscript journal of the proceedings of the Assemblies 1638 and 1639, which I know is in the hands of severals, and it agrees everywhere with the Latin history, and may justly be reckoned of equal authority with any manuscript of this kind. Only the reader may notice that the speeches of the members of Assembly which are recorded in the journal, some of which I have transcribed, seem to have been taken in shorthand when they were delivered, and therefore must needs labor under some disadvantage. Yet I thought it might give some light into the proceedings of the Assembly 1638, and I hope it will not be disagreeable to the reader that I have transcribed a few of them. And what I intend for the vindication of our reforming period from 1638 to 1649 I shall cast into the following sections. Section 1. A short historical account of that glorious appearance of God for the Church of Scotland in the year 1638. Before I give a particular account of that remarkable turn of affairs in this church and the land in the year 1637 and 1638, I do not reckon it amiss to take notice of some things by which the Lord paved a way for this great and glorious revolution. Though the persecution was hot against some eminent ministers, yet many, by the special providence of God, had a peaceable residence at their several pastoral charges. Some of them were protected by persons of considerable distinction. Not a few of the first rank in Scotland did distinguish themselves by a concern for the purity of gospel ordinances. Even before the year 1638, the pride and ambition of the prelates rendered them odious to many of the first rank and quality in Scotland. And besides, several, both of the nobility and gentry, retained a love and regard for our Reformation purity, and therefore many eminent ministers were countenanced and protected in the peaceable exercise of their ministry. Amongst others, Mr. David Dixon, minister at Irvine, after he was deprived by the High Commission Court and confined to Turriff in the north, was, through the Earl of Eglinton's influence, liberated from his confinement and restored unto the exercise of his ministry at Irvine. Likewise, though the violence of the bishops before the year 1638 was great, yet it was nothing like the tyranny and fury of the prelates in the late times of prelacy, as the reader may see from Mr. Woodrow's history, where, stating the difference betwixt the prelates in the late times and the former bishops, he observes, quote, that the old set of bishops made by the Parliament 1612 were but pygmies to the present high and mighty lords, unquote. Hence many faithful ministers who did not countenance the diocesan synods, and yet had yet peaceable residence in their own parishes, the Lord made the wrath of man to praise him, and the remainder of wrath he did restrain. And here I cannot but notice one thing which paved the way for the great turn of affairs, and by which the Lord prepared a people for himself, namely, the remarkable success that did attend gospel ordinances under the ministry of such faithful gospel ministers at this time, who had not conformed to prelacy. The author of the Fulfilling of the Scriptures, on page 416, reports that there was a very solemn and extraordinary outletting of the Spirit about the year 1625, and thereafter in the west of Scotland, and particularly under the ministry of Mr. Dixon at Irvine. As also he mentions that solemn communion at the Kirk of Shotts, at which time, says he, there was so convincing an appearance of God and downpouring of the Spirit, even in an extraordinary way, that to follow the ordinance, especially that sermon on Monday, with a strange and unusual motion on the hearers, who in a great multitude were there convened of diverse ranks, that it was known, which, adds he, I can speak on sure ground, near 500 had at that time a discernible change wrought on them, of whom most proved lively Christians afterwards, etc. Likewise, about this time, solemn fasts were observed through the land, on account of the present dismal and deplorable state of the Church of Scotland. Here I shall transcribe the testimony of an adversary, that is, Bishop Guthrie, who in his Memoirs, page 8, speaking of the honest ministers of that period, he tells us, they labored to increase the number of their proselytes everywhere, and that not without success, especially in Fife and in the western parts. Whereunto, says he, a way which they begun, proven very conducible, and this it was. They kept sometimes every year a fast in every kirk throughout the kingdom, where the ministers were of their stamp, that is, upon the first Sabbath of every quarter, whereof there was no public intimation, save that the ministers did privately desire so many of their flock, as from time to time they could draw over to their party to join it. And upon those days of fasting they used in their doctrine to hint at the danger of the religion by prelacy, and the dependencies thereof, and in their prayers to supplicate for remedy with a blessing upon all good means, which Providence should afford for that end, by which course they prevailed much upon the commons. This perfidious and apostate prelate does everywhere in his Memoirs misrepresent the proceedings of faithful ministers both before and after 1638. But from his above words we may gather what was true matter of fact, that is, that the honest ministers at that time kept solemn fasts for mourning over the sins and backslidings of the land, and for prayer unto the Lord for a revival unto his work in Scotland, and the Lord was pleased to give a gracious return unto their prayers in the year 1638. I proceed now to give a short account as I can of the beginning and progress of that remarkable appearance of the Lord in the foresaid year. In the year 1637, a liturgy with a book of canons being framed by the bishops of Scotland, King Charles I resolved, however disagreeable they were unto a great many in the Church of Scotland, to impose the same upon that church. His design is now open and declared, to bring the Church of Scotland unto a full conformity with the Church of England. The liturgy devised for Scotland was in several particulars worse than the English liturgy, and more agreeable to that of the Church of Rome. The Latin historian gives some instances of this purpose. And by the Book of Canons designed to be imposed upon the Church of Scotland, presbyteries and sessions which yet subsisted were wholly suppressed. But when our night was most dark, behold, the day breaks. When our strength seemeth to be quite gone, the Lord of hosts awoke for his oppressed heritage. His right hand and his holy arm did work deliverance for them. When the liturgy is at first imposed upon Scotland, a shaking began amongst the dry bones. This shaking did wax louder and louder, and the bones came together, bone unto bone, and lo, the sinews came upon them, and the skin covered them above, and the Spirit of life from the Lord did enter into ministers and professors, yea, into all ranks of persons through the land. According to King Charles I, his express orders, the liturgy is first opened in the great church of Edinburgh by the Dean, with the assistance of the bishop of that diocese, upon the 23rd of July, 1637. But the most part of the people, rising at that instant, the reading was stopped, and in the like manner in another of the churches, where the Bishop of Argyle was attempting to read it, within a short time supplications were given in to the council against the liturgy of the Book of Canons by several ministers and professors through the land. And in a few weeks, the most part of the nobility and gentry and the most part of the royal boroughs declared themselves against the above impositions upon the Church of Scotland. In the month of September, the foresaid year, a great number of ministers with elders convene at Edinburgh and supplicate the council against the same. Likewise, several petitions signed by several persons of all ranks against the service book and the Book of Canons were put into the hands of the Duke of Lennox. who was then going to the court, that he might present them to the king. And in the meantime the Privy Council discharged the bishops to press the liturgy, till the king should be informed about the present state of matters in Scotland. Upon which the ministers and elders that were met at Edinburgh retired unto their several dwellings. The elders, who upon this occasion came with the ministers to Edinburgh, consisted, according to the Latin historian, of the nobility and of the chief magistrates of the burghs, and he reported that upon their return home, quote, public fasts were kept, that the Lord might turn the counsel of the king unto the public good of his church and kingdom, and that he might disappoint the projects then on foot against the Church of Scotland, so much shaken already by the subtle devices of her adversaries, unquote. The return to the above supplications and informations from the Privy Council came down from the king in the month of October. Upon this occasion there was a vast confluence from all parts of the country to Edinburgh, according to the bishop in his memoirs, page 24. Quote, multitudes of people from several parts of the land flocked to Edinburgh to join in supplicating, and that so generally that besides the increase of noblemen who had not been formerly there were few or no shires on the fourth of the Grampian hills, from which came not gentlemen, burghers, ministers, and commons, unquote. But no favorable answer was given to the supplications that had been sent up to the king, and a proclamation was issued forth, charging all the supplicants to depart out of the town within 24 hours under the pain of rebellion, as also the Court of Session and the Privy Council were ordered within a set time to remove from Edinburgh. But, notwithstanding of the above proclamation, the petitioners continued in the town. Their numbers did daily increase, and by this time all the burghs except Aberdeen had declared themselves against the above innovations in the worship of God. And when the petitioners saw that their former supplications were not regarded, and when they considered that the cause in which they had interested themselves was a public and common cause, they resolved that they would act no more in a separate capacity as hitherto they had done, but in a more unite and joint capacity. And about this time these meetings were formed, which were commonly called the tables. They consisted of the nobility, of the gentlemen from the shires, of the magistrates from the burghs, and of ministers from all corners of the land. These meetings did not assume to themselves any judicial power, but were held for consultation and mutual advice with respect to the proper measures that should be taken for the redress of their present grievances. After the above proclamations were made, a petition was agreed upon to be given in to the Privy Council, containing a complaint against the bishops as authors of the liturgy and of the book of canons, as renters of the church and underminers of religion, as movers of discontent between the king and his subjects, and of discord between subject and subject. And in regard the most part of the bishops were members of the Privy Council, they not only craved that the above charge against them might be put to the trial, but also they state them as parties, and crave that they should not be and crave that they be not suffered to sit any more as judges until the cause is tried and decided according to justice. The Latin historian reports that a vast number of all ranks subscribed the above petition and complaint, and that it was adhered to by all who had at heart to assert the liberties of the Church and the purity of divine worship in opposition to the tyranny of bishops and superstition. The number of petitioners did daily increase at Edinburgh, and the Privy Council had none to support their authority. All Scotland almost being now engaged on the side of the petitioners, the bishops and their adherents were become a despicable party. But, in regard, it was judged inexpedient that such numbers should continue in Edinburgh, as also because the council were offered at such numerous meetings. Therefore it was agreed betwixt the Privy Council and the petitioners that some few should be chosen by the petitioners themselves out of their own number to remain at Edinburgh, there to attend upon and answer to their several petitions, supplications, and complaints.